Welcome to this webinar. Before we begin the presentation, I want to provide you with a few housekeeping items. On your screen, you will see a taskbar with icons. Each icon is assigned to a particular element of today's webinar. After the webinar is over, please take our survey to tell us how we've done. Throughout the presentation, you can network with others or submit questions to the speakers in the box next to the slides. Download resources from the folder icon. Today's event is being recorded and archived and will be available within 24 hours. For on-demand questions or comments, send us an email by clicking Email Us. If you experience any technical issues today, please refresh your browser by hitting F5 for a PC or Command R for Macs, or email webinars@bmpmedia.com for one-on-one support. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's moderator.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, A Unified Approach to Global Security Response. This event, brought to you by Security Magazine, is sponsored by Everbridge. I'm your moderator, Maria Henriquez, Associate Editor of Security Magazine. Thanks for joining us. Today's presenter is Imad Moulin. Imad is the Chief Technology Officer for Everbridge. In this role, Moulin is responsible for Everbridge's market strategy, product roadmap, innovation, and research and development. Don't forget to submit your questions, and later in the program, our presenter will address as many as possible. Today's event is being recorded and archived on securitymagazine.com/webinars. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's presenter, Imad Moulin.
Thank you very much, and thank you for Security Magazine for organizing this. So today we're going to talk about a unified approach to global security and incident response. We're going to start fairly slowly with some fairly simple concepts, hopefully. So stick with us. Things will get a little bit more aspirational towards the end. We will start with a couple of just definitions. But let's start with the concept of critical events. Now, these are all of these bad things that are happening on a consistent basis these days, 24/7. Here, of course, we're talking about workplace violence and active assailants and risks to travelers and potentially even things that may disrupt your supply chain or even, in some cases, IT outages. And if you're more on the security side and are wondering why an IT outage might be part of this topic, please just hang in there. We'll get there. But again, the point here is that there are a lot of disruptive things that may be happening around the country, around the globe, wherever you do business all the time. And it doesn't look like that trend is reversing anytime soon. So this is the moment where we start with things that are very, very simple. So we're going to go back to this simple value proposition a few times. Idea here is that there are good things and there are bad things, right? So the good things are the things that you care about, the things that make your organization work, the things that make your organization, your people, your assets, things that you count on. The bad things are those things that you worry about. And these will be risk events that we'll discuss in a bit more detail. So a critical event typically is, very simply, when one of those bad things is impacting one of the things that you care about. And the whole idea is you want to know about it and then do something about it. So if I were to go one step further, I would simply replace the good things with your assets, the bad things with risk events. To go one step further, generally speaking, those assets, those things you care about, usually start with your people. Then you may have your buildings, facilities, branch offices, etc. Certainly your entire supply chain, including the routes that connect you and your suppliers, and again, this can be physical or digital. Certainly your IT systems, because a massive disruption in your IT systems can have as bad an impact as one that impacts your facilities physically. And of course, let's not forget your reputation, your brand. Having #mycompany trend for the wrong reasons can be as disruptive to an organization as just about anything that may happen. So on the other side, on the bad things side, you have your risk events, which may be internal and external. And again, if those impact your assets, you've got a critical event. Now, what's interesting here is that even within those categories, on the right or on the left, things will change depending on context, depending on potentially your role, depending on your purview, the scope of your responsibilities. So if I'm dealing with physical security issues, all of a sudden I may want to view my people in various subcategories. Employees versus expats, expats versus travelers, travelers versus visitors, or visitors versus employees. Simply because what may be a critical event for a traveler may not be for an employee. A massive strike for transportation in some cases. In some countries around the world, that may happen every day. So local employees are used to it. For a traveler, that may be extremely disruptive, and they may not be able to accomplish what they want to. It may even be an impact to their safety. So again, depending on the type of risk event, the categorization of people, of buildings and facilities, may have an impact as to whether a mere risk event is going to turn into a critical event or not. Similarly, if I switch categories completely, a massive IT failure, for example, I'm no longer categorizing people as travelers or employees. The subcategories may be things like internal users versus consumers versus power users or admins. My risk events may be internal, such as a change management issue or a data center outage, or external, like a third-party provider outage or a DDoS attack, etc. So again, we're still dealing with some of the basic definitions here. The issue, of course, is that in most organizations, you may have well-defined processes, or you may not. You could have processes that are either non-existent, completely disjointed, certainly somewhere in between. So think about it this way. If something bad were to happen, are you able to very quickly, number one, just know about it? Trust that information, no matter where it's coming from. Understand very clearly whether it impacts you at all or not. Do you care about that bad thing happening? Or was it a swing and a miss? And if so, what's the scope or the impact? At that point in time, do you know what your risk is? Do you know what the impact is? Do you know what you need to do about it in order to go back to business as usual? Do you know who needs to be involved? Those are good questions to ask yourselves and see whether there is a reason for you to consider a more streamlined approach to managing critical events. Typically, the reason for this might be that your organization is siloed, that a lot of the data that you're seeing may be noisy, that you may not necessarily have a handle on all of your assets, all of your people, especially if they're in transit. And ultimately, from an internal perspective, you may not have the right information, the right plans to make decisions at the right time. That may make any type of resolution, any type of overall incident response somewhat slower, in some cases muddled or unclear, and unfortunately, in most cases, reactive as opposed to proactive, which certainly means that it's going to have an impact on how quickly you can resolve issues. And we certainly all know where this is going to lead, depending on the type of organization that you're leading, right? Certainly, if we're dealing with the health and safety issues, that may mean that more employees are at risk. If we're dealing with a security issue that impacts the operations of your organization, that means that the disruption may last longer, which of course may have an impact on your customers, be they internal and external, their confidence in you and your organization. And certainly in as a worst case scenario, having a direct impact on your revenue, your brand, or whatever the mission of your organization is. So, and unfortunately, this isn't the sort of thing that we could just wait for or hope it doesn't happen. These types of issues, of critical events, are costly, happen more and more frequently, are known to the outside world much more quickly, and certainly have quite a bit of real costs associated with them. So, that was just a little bit of a setup. What I'd like to move to right now is a set of just best practices, and we'll throw in a little bit of data here and there. So these are 9 best practices. We're not talking about any particular framework. I will very briefly mention one particular framework we like here at Everbridge at the very end. But as I mentioned before, some of these best practices may seem simple, elementary even, at least at the beginning. But again, feel free to roll your eyes, but stick with me, because we'll be building upon those simple best practices and describing some slightly more complex ones that you may even deem to be somewhat aspirational. So, let's start with number 1. Number 1 is, guess what? Just have a plan. Yep, it seems elementary, but in some of our surveys, it does turn out that some of you do not have a plan, or will only create a plan once you've experienced some type of disruption or critical event. So for those of you who don't know where to start, we say, again, basic stuff, cover the basics. What are the types of things that you may encounter? And then categorize them by type. What type of an issue is this? What type of plan is this? Business continuity, crisis management. Are these routine emergencies versus crisis emergencies? Routine emergencies being those that you can somewhat predict will happen and have a well-known response for them. Crisis emergencies are those that are past that. Either you don't have a proper response or haven't necessarily figured out a plan for them, so you need a plan for those types, right? And again, in many cases, whether you're dealing with a natural disaster or a man-made issue or technology failure, the types of people, tasks, steps that you will need to undertake in your plan will be different. And again, same with the scope of the issues that you may encounter. One that is contained will require a different type of plan versus one that is completely widespread. So, speaking of data, we commissioned back in July of 2018 an independent research by Forrester that really was meant to evaluate the state of global security response, looking at everything from what have you seen as security professionals, and by the way, the respondents were all security executives at mostly large companies and mostly VPs and above. So lots of questions that we asked, including trying to understand how optimized, operationalized companies approached was to managing critical events. So, by the way, we've included a copy of the entire study and its results in a PDF that you should be able to download straight from the app here. But I'm going to just share with you a couple of interesting pieces, certainly from the survey piece. We asked, on the left-hand side, from which of the following types of critical events has your company suffered in the past 24 months? First one is, of course, a no-brainer. You know, natural disasters, extreme weather. Right? We're seeing this all the time. 33%. Honestly, I was surprised. I thought it would be a little higher. And then you see everything else. right? So for those of you asking, why are we dealing with IT failures here? Well, it's because you have told us that you view those as security failures, as security issues as well. Your peers. So IT failures, cyber attacks, executive protection threats, brand and reputational crises, and then you go down to the bottom, and fortunately, things like terrorism or active terror or active shooter are at 14% and 11%. Still very, very high for just the last 24 months. Now, if you go back on the right-hand side, we asked a separate question, a follow-on question, right? Thinking back to the critical events your organization has faced in the past 24 months, how severe was the impact overall in each of the following categories? And we asked for those that are either severe or large impact. So number one was customer safety, 59%. Another 59% for employee safety. And you're seeing all of the ones down the list, from brand and reputation, revenue, executive protection, VIP safety, etc. So these critical events are real. They're impactful. They go across, they run across the gamut. You are reporting those to us. You're telling us that you're experiencing them, that they are frequent, and that they are impactful. So that's why having that plan, at least covering these categories, should be a good first step. Now, this report, as I mentioned before, is available to you through a download. Please take a look at it. Always happy to discuss some of the findings in more detail offline whenever you would like. Planning, of course, is important. However, there's always going to be a gap between planning and executing. I'm sure you've all heard of some variant of the famous quote that plans are useless, but planning is essential. The point here is that there's going to be a gap between the plan and the execution, the planning and the executing. The amount of activity that happens left of boom tends to be somewhat timid compared to what you'll actually see when you're finally going through an incident response process. We'll go back to this a little bit later on, but please remember this as to how much activity you're going to need to go through as part of the response on an emergency basis, the follow-on crisis management processes, and of course the business recovery. So maintaining some level of flexibility, of agility, as you find out what's happening on the ground is going to be key. So let's move on to the next best practice. And this one is really more about establishing a cross-domain approach. And I'm going to set it up by simply asking a couple of simple questions. A hurricane's headed your way, which, if you're a distributed multinational, may be happening multiple times a day. And you happen to have a data center there. So let me ask, what type of an issue is this that we're dealing with? Is this a security issue? Security or life and safety issue? Is this an IT issue? Is this a business continuity issue? Hurricane headed your way, and oh, by the way, amongst your many assets, there may be a data center there. Well, you know, I think he probably guessed the answer, not that complicated. The answer is D, all of the above, potentially. Now let's look at it the other way around. I've got a business critical application that has experienced a cyber attack. What type of an issue is this? Is this a security issue, an InfoSec issue, an IT issue, a BC issue? Of course, it's all of the above. So what does that mean from a planning perspective? Sure, you probably have to have a plan for each one of these. But what's also important is to build the appropriate relationships within your own organizations. You know, each of you have a different org structure. Some of you have the CISO reporting to the CSO. Some of you have the CISO reporting to the CIO. Some of you have all of those be completely separate. But the key is, in just about any type of situation that you see coming in, there's likely going to be some type of overlap in roles and responsibilities. A civil unrest issue is going to be a security issue and a business continuity issue, right? The cyber attack will be somewhere in the middle. Security, IT, InfoSec, business continuity, depending on the overall impact, et cetera, et cetera. So the key is you cannot hope to achieve the appropriate type of response once this situation is underway. The relationships, the cross-domain planning needs to have happened long beforehand. Otherwise, the best that you can hope for is that you will be reactive and ultimately not nearly as successful as you would really want to be. So build those relationships, build those partnerships. Think about incident response in a cross-domain way. That hurricane headed towards you is going to be and require a business continuity plan, a life and safety plan, a security plan, a supply chain disruption plan, an IT and disaster recovery plan. So, first, have a plan. 2, build the appropriate cross-domain partnerships and relationships to ensure that these plans can work not in silos, but across the different departments. Now, 3, we're going to move on to the bad things. What you have to line up is all of your data sources, those that can tell you when something bad has happened. You don't want to be relying on watching CNN or Fox News or BBC to try to figure out if you should be worried about something happening. So we like to categorize those risk data sources into 3 distinct categories. One is the alert sources, sources that will tell you that something bad has happened somewhere around the world. So it could be that a hurricane is headed your way, that a bomb has exploded somewhere, that there is an active assailant somewhere, or that an earthquake has just hit a particular area. The second category is what we call context feeds or sources. Now, these are the sources that aren't going to tell you that something bad has happened, but these are the sources that you rely on to gain a deeper situational intelligence understanding of what's going on, better situational awareness. For example, there's an evacuation being called for somewhere in Florida. Okay, what is the impact of that evacuation on traffic on your near your facilities? Can you overlay a traffic map right then and there? Can you, as a matter of fact, get visibility as to what's going on by popping up some traffic cameras? So that's that additional context that may help you determine as to whether you need to do something different from what that pre-planned plan calls for. Because again, you're likely not going to follow that plan to a T. And then that third category of data sources is going to be your reference. Those are the additional piece of information that you want at your fingertips as you're making different decisions for how to respond to a particular incident. It could be anything from the power grid to local police stations, hospitals, gas stations, etc. The ability to have all this information at your fingertips is going to be key. Now, we talked about the bad things. Let's go back to the good things. So for number 4, a plan isn't going to be very useful without you identifying what's critical to your organizations. So your critical assets and your critical functions. right? And again, I'm talking about doing this beyond going into your BIAs, et cetera, et cetera. This is a much more operational view of identifying your critical assets and functions that needs to be as real-time as possible, going from knowing who your employees are and where they belong to your visitors, your offices, your facilities, your supply routes, et cetera. From a use case perspective, understand how those impact your employee life and safety, continuity of your operations, all of your critical IT services, and even your supply chains. And do not forget about your brand. Because again, the impact that that can have on an organization can be, in some cases, bigger than a physical security event. So identify them. And once you identify them, you've got to be able to locate them. And here, we're not just talking about the people who are impacted. As a matter of fact, I'm going to put those third on the list. Right? The first one, the first set of stakeholders that you need to be able to very, very quickly identify and locate are those who can help. And that needs to be context dependent. It needs to be dependent on the situation, on the type of event that it is, on its location, on its severity, on its scope, right? Who is a member of that crisis management team? Do we need to have somebody from the executive team on the phone? Can that team that's on the ground right now be responsible for all the entire command and control? Can they be responsible for all of the business-related decisions, such as shutting down all your operations or all your doors or your website? So who can help? Then, of course, it's who is impacted and who needs to know. You've got to be able to identify them and locate them. And locating them sometimes means understanding a variety of things about them. Identifying them may mean knowing what their skill sets are. It may mean, if they're impacted, what their special needs are. If you need to evacuate a building, do you know if you have anybody who's limited in their mobility or who's power dependent, who will not be able to self-evacuate? Do you have that information at your fingertips? From a location perspective, you may be able to figure out if somebody is supposed to be in a particular location because they're on call or on duty. For those who can help, same thing. You need to know what the duty rosters look like. And again, a plan is going to tell you how aggressive your escalation procedure needs to be so you can get the right people helping out. Furthermore, from a location perspective, you need to go beyond your typical static location awareness capabilities. And static locations meaning I know where employees live, and therefore I know if they're going to be impacted by that wildfire. Or I know what offices they're assigned to, and therefore they're the ones that I'm going to try to reach out to if I need to evacuate that office. You need to go to dynamic locations. You need to know whether those employees are traveling somewhere, whether they're physically in the building because they're swiped their badge, and that you have that knowledge from your physical access control system. The whole point here is you've got that information available to you somewhere within your organization. The question is it at your fingertips? Does it come to you, or do you have to go and try to grab it from 7 different systems? Do you even have the plan with the appropriate permissions that allow you to get to that point? It's good to know which of your employees work and live in London. Do you know which of your employees are also on their way to London, because you need to let them know that there may be an event happening there that is going to impact them? So identify and locate all of the appropriate stakeholders, including, of course, the ones that are impacted. Now, bad things, good things. We've got our plan. We've built the relationships. We've figured out if something bad has happened. And I know where all the things and people that I care about are, so I can figure out whether there is an impact or not. That's what that next step is going to help us do. So, can we quantify and prioritize that risk, especially if it's happening simultaneously across multiple locations around the globe, right? What's the risk to your organization? How high up the priority list should it be? What type of response do you need? Well, you'll need to quantify that risk. It's a fairly straightforward formula, right? Your threat, how big is it? Understanding the timeline. Is it emergent versus dynamic? Is it tactical or completely strategic? And then what's the vulnerability that you have in your organization? Because, of course, the more vulnerable you are to that type of threat, the higher the risk. And then, of course, you multiply that by the impact. Is it simply one minor office that's unoccupied that's going to be impacted, or is it your headquarters or your main manufacturing facility? Now, to get to the next level, understanding the cultural and geographic differences can make all the difference in the world. Having that local context that tells you that, you know what, maybe in New York, this would be considered a high risk event. But you know what? In London, it's not. Or vice versa. So you have to be able to view the threat, the vulnerability, the impact with those geographic differences in mind in order to come up with the right risk quantification. Because that is what's going to help you assess how aggressive a response you will need to have. An example is one that I've used before, that massive disruption in public transport. In some cases, it could slow you down or grind your operations to a halt. In other places around the world where people are more used to that and know how to work around that system and those bottlenecks, people will find a way. They've always done so. So your impact is going to be somewhat smaller. In that first example, you know what? Security may need to be involved. In that latter example, no, not your problem. Again, I'm trying to use milder examples here as opposed to anything that has blood and gore associated with it. But hopefully you get the idea. So here we're trying to figure out, again, what that risk looks like. Well, the next thing, of course, is let's see if we can bring everything together. You've got to have a more common operating environment to bring this information all in. As we said before, you probably have access to this somehow. All the locations of all your people, all of these data sources, try to bring them together. Manage things not just through some pretty picture where you're bringing all this stuff into a pretty map, but it's got to be a common operating environment. You've got to be able to collaborate with others within the organization to make sure that you're all on the same page. And then start thinking about what tasks are part of your plan that can be automated, that can be orchestrated by the system, that can be ultimately initiated as quickly as possible so nothing falls through the cracks. Make sure that if there are things that are time sensitive, if they cannot wait for human approval, that they can get done quickly. For example, tornado heading towards one of your locations. So what do you do then? Should you get an alert into your GSOC and say, hey, folks, there's a tornado heading towards a location where we have a couple of facilities. Can I get permission to go ahead and order an evacuation? Yeah, sure, go ahead, do that. All right, let me work on that and launch that notification to all those folks. You know, for a tornado, you may have as little as 6 minutes before it actually hits you. If you're lucky, 12. In those situations, it may be worth taking the risk to say that's a type of initiation that you can afford to let the system simply take over and do it, and let you know that it's doing it. Because every second can mean a difference between life and death. In other cases, what an automation would do for you is simply let you know what's going on and have you then take over. But the sooner you know, the sooner a plan can be put in motion, the faster you can go back to business as usual. The faster you can resolve the situation. And a common operating environment would let you ensure that information that's coming in from your risk event feeds, information that's needed so that the right plan can be executed, information that can go out to the appropriate stakeholders, is all consistent. Nothing falls through the cracks. It can also show us, for example, that, hey, there's a workflow that I will need to trigger, that triggers 3 different workflows. I will need to ultimately notify my crisis management team. As a matter of fact, I may need to formulate who the members of my CMT are based on the nature of the situation, based on the location, based on the time of day, and then activate the bridge for them to all get on. I'll need to send out an all-employee accountability message and get back ultimately the list of potentially impacted employees, and then follow up with a next set of instructions for those that do happen to be in an impacted area and happen to be impacted. You know, at that point in time, I may have a plan that will tell me whether I should wake up some of the executives, and if so, whom, and at what point does it get severe enough so that it is okay. As a matter of fact, it is required to wake up the CEO at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning and then send the appropriate sit rep. All of that becomes far more stressful to do if you have to make these types of decisions in the midst of a crisis. Far less so if, number one, you've planned for them, and number two, even better, you've at least templatized or even better automated some of these capabilities so that even the individual tasks that a plan ultimately needs to have will be tracked by the system so nothing falls through the cracks. And then, last but not least, we're going to talk about looking back and analyzing the performance. So this is our really last best practice in this case. But let me walk you back through the framework that I had mentioned. And the framework is simple enough, right? Once you have the plan in place, once you've built the relationships and therefore can execute on them, during any type of incident life cycle, you've left with really 4 individual steps or categories, right? The ability to first and foremost detect that something bad has happened and then do that assessment of the event, that contextual assessment that we mentioned a few times. 2, you will then need to identify and locate the appropriate stakeholders, especially those who are impacted, so that you can figure out what your true impact is, what your true risk quantification looks like. Do you care that that bad thing happened or not? Is it going to disrupt your organization? Do you have people who are impacted? And then it's time to act. If you have a plan in place, you can have then an initiation of that plan, whether it's simply a communications workflow that goes out and ensure that all the right people are on board, that all the impacted people are okay, or kicking off a plan with individual tasks that can be then managed to ensure that you can go back to business as usual as quickly as possible. But then what we haven't talked about is that last step, the analysis step. It can start with something as simple as the after action report. Knowing and looking back without pointing fingers, this is not a finger pointing exercise, as to exactly how we did. Because that's the only way we can learn and become better at it. But if you were to then do this on a programmatic basis, you may be able to close that loop and leverage information from past incidents as part of that very initial step to understand how to mitigate that impact, lessen it, maybe even eliminate it, by knowing what you did well and what you didn't. Right? Which teams were better at responding to what types of events? Which tasks that were part of the plan were actually effective and which slowed us down? Which tasks weren't part of the plan and the crisis management team decided to add them on an ad hoc basis and they actually made a difference? Those 3 times that you added them versus the 7 times that we saw a similar incident and you didn't add them. That closing of the loop can help you learn from what you did well and what you didn't do so well before, and making sure that that knowledge doesn't get lost, and that as part of that initial assessment, you're taking back with you those learnings, that capability, and making things better. So, those were the 9 best practices, from having a plan, to building the cross-domain relationships, to lining up your data sources, to identifying all of your assets, to being able to locate them, to then quantifying your risk, to ensuring you could manage that incident response through a common operating environment, to automating aspects of the incident response, and then analyzing your performance. 9 best practices, from the incredibly simple to the slightly more aspirational. To sum up, if you were to look at just the incident response framework, this is a slightly more summarized version of what the Assess, Locate, Act, and Analyze framework will do. And the point here is to see if there is a way to reduce the number of critical event response systems that most organizations have into fewer, or just one. So at this point, I would like to turn it over to the moderators, and so we can look at some of the questions. Please keep them coming.
All right. Thanks, Imad, for a great presentation. Before we have our presenter address some questions that have been submitted throughout the program, I wanted to remind you that we'd love your feedback in our webinar survey to help improve our program. And please don't forget to keep submitting your questions. And now, for the first question, where do we get threat intelligence data?
So threat intelligence data can come from a variety of sources. So certainly here at Everbridge, we have our own feed of threat intelligence data that comes from both scraping automatic sources, or scraping sources automatically, doing automatic categorization of them, natural language processing to pull out severity, category, locations, points of interest, persons of interest, etc., as well as pulling out information from our own customers who happen to be in the public safety arena who want this information to be disseminated, and a team of analysts that can take all of that, through the software and ultimately send out a single aggregated feed with all of the appropriate information. We also partner with a variety of third parties that provide their own feeds, as well as bring in feeds about weather, geological issues, traffic, et cetera, all in one place.
All right, great. Thanks for your response. Another question is, how do you get your employees to opt in to safety and security programs like this?
How do you get employees to opt in? That's probably one of the most commonly asked questions. And in many cases, the answers vary based on where you are, the culture, the systems that are available at your disposal, etc. At the very least, you have the ability to enroll employees if you happen to have some information about them in your HR database without necessarily crossing the line, especially in some countries around privacy issues. But at the very least, the ability to have some contact information to send them the appropriate communications when something has happened or is about to happen. Secondly, there are other pieces of information that can come in. So we, for example, can pull in itinerary information for any travel that is done for corporate reasons. And part of what you can then start figuring out in that case is, based on what region and what country you're in, what is it that you're allowed to do without necessarily asking for an opt-in versus what is it that you require either some type of collective bargaining or individual opt-in to actually do. What we've noticed, though, all of that being set aside, is that there has been a higher propensity for employees around the world, even in European countries, to want to opt in after some of the horrific incidents, especially after the Paris attack. The tide has shifted. And more importantly, what typically happens is employees are much more eager to opt in and offer their personal contact information, for example, if they see that they've missed out on being informed. So, for example, there was an office closing due to a snowstorm, a weather event, etc., and the company wasn't able to reach out to them, so they had to trek halfway across town just to find out that they didn't have to be at work, for example. So in the aftermath of events, as benign as a snowstorm may be, you may find employees far more willing to go ahead and opt in, especially when you don't have information for them. We've also seen companies, for example, putting together policies that say that if you want to travel to certain countries, for example, then you must give us this information. At the very least, we'll make it or make use of it, including your location information, while you are traveling. Otherwise, we will not authorize that type of travel, because that travel may not necessarily be a condition of employment. So a variety of techniques that are easily employed. We probably should have an entire best practices webinar on this very topic alone. But again, happy to discuss some at more length offline, whoever would like to know.
All right, thank you. Another question is, what are the best ways to ensure my teams are always properly trained to react to a critical event?
Yeah, not a simple answer there. I'm sure there are quite a few chief security officers and others who could give a much better answer than I can to something like this, because again, it'll depend on your demographics. It'll depend on the type of organization that you are. We certainly suggest doing drills in many cases, depending again on the type of organization and where in the world you are. Drills are always a good way of at least knowing that, you know what, people can receive the information and act upon it. In some cases, drills can be generic. They can be simply communications-oriented. Let's make sure we can reach you, that you can read the instructions, you can respond. In some cases, they can be far more specific, right? We, for example, you know, in certain parts of the world, you do want to have active shooter drills, for example, that happen every so often. You do want to understand what your bottlenecks are, and you do want to understand that people need to react to it. In other parts of the world, that may not necessarily be a must-have. So there's one thing, which is to say, okay, sit through a webinar and make sure that you go through these 5 or 6 slides as part of a yearly certification. There's another to actually have a drill, whether it involves evacuating a building or dealing with an active shooter situation, as long as you let people know that it is a drill.
All right, thanks for a great response. Another question is, how can we get companies to invest in creating a proper security response?
How do we get a company to create the proper security response? Well, a big part of it is creating those relationships and partnerships that I mentioned before can be of a big help. So in many cases, being able to say, look, here's what the impact of a good security program will have on the business, right? And ultimately, there is an ROI to it beyond simply doing the right thing by our employees, which is to make sure that they are safe. That alone can be, for many organizations, good enough. For others, may require a little bit more, and to say, look, right, if we don't have a program like this in place, here's how much longer it will take us to recover from any of these types of situations. And these situations are happening far more frequently than you may think. A good security program isn't an insurance policy. It's a must-have. So what is the cost of not doing it? What is the potential risk if we have a disruption? Whether it's to our people, to our supply chain, or to ultimately our operations. If you start thinking about it from that perspective, that may be easier to convince the powers that be to put in the appropriate investments. Next question, please.
All right. What's the difference between disaster recovery and incident management? Is one more technical than the other?
Well, I mean, from a disaster recovery perspective, the incident management is something that you'll do on a more operational basis. For disaster recovery to happen, you have to have some type of an overall disaster, whether it's on the IT side, meaning that ultimately you've got an entire system that's down and you're trying to recover from that, versus simply having incident management, which may happen almost on an operational basis. So yes, there is going to be a fairly big difference between the two, with disaster recovery having a far more defined scope across the board. Disaster recovery and planning for disaster recovery will need to happen, again, after there is a disaster, when you're recovering from it. And very different when you're dealing with an IT disaster recovery plan from one that is impacting your physical facilities or whatnot. But from an incident management perspective, you may have an incident management process that you are invoking on an ongoing basis without there really being a disaster or a disaster to recover from.
All right, thank you. Another question is related to identifying and locating people. How do you stay within GDPR requirements outside the U.S.?
Okay, so the GDPR requirements are actually outside of the U.S. going to be the least of your issues when it comes to identifying and locating people. So let me put right that on the table. The GDPR requirements, around the data ownership and so on and so forth can fairly easily be met. You're going to have much bigger issues in certain countries, especially in Europe, that go beyond GDPR when you have to deal with the likes of the works councils. Right, when you start saying that you need to hold on to information about your employees that may not be necessarily immediately obvious as to why you would. Why do you need an employee's cell phone number? That has nothing to do with that employee's job. So in many cases, you are going to have to come up with a good answer to that. Well, guess what? You know what? That employee is going to opt in to give you that cell phone number so you can text that employee in case they need to not come into work because of a strike or a snowstorm or whatnot. They will give you that one if need be. So you will have, depending on the country, whether you're dealing with Germany or whether you're dealing with Switzerland, with a higher level of local compliance than GDPR alone. And this is very similar to ultimately the answer that I gave earlier about getting employees to opt in. So part of what we've done is also really structured who has access to what data under what circumstances? Is all of that data, and now this goes back a little bit more to GDPR, right? Do we need to collect all of that data for what circumstances? Who needs to really have access to what data and under what circumstances? So for example, you need to be able to put in protections to ensure that it doesn't matter how high your admin rights are, that you can't just go in and try to track the location of somebody outside of a critical event being declared, right? Or track them to see where they are even if it's outside of business hours. Now you do need, and you may still have a duty of care outside of business hours. How do you manage and balance the two? So part of what we've done is put in a multi-tiered system around role-based access control on the one hand, who can access what information under what circumstances, but even one around when the data is collected and how it is disclosed. So for example, you know what, if somebody travels, they may opt in for, say, their phone to share the location because they happen to be on a business trip. But after hours, they could shut that off if they want to go do something else. However, they can leave a different type of location sharing capability which will not modify their profile. So nobody can go in, for example, a supervisor, a manager, the types of things that your works councils, for example, are going to worry about. You cannot just simply go in and say, hey, last night you were at a bar after hours, or you were at a concert. But the system can still figure out whether it should be monitoring that environment, for example, that concert for a terrorist attack or whatnot, and ultimately ensure that the appropriate protocol can be kicked off and that duty of care is still in place for that employee without ever disclosing their location to their supervisor, manager, or other coworkers. So lots of nuanced protections in place to increase the opt-ins, to ensure that we're on the right side of GDPR and the variety of works councils that are out there putting these protections in place, and ultimately to ensure that people, that employees are happy about opting in.
All right, great. Another question is, how can we communicate with affected parties when communication is completely shut down during a crisis?
Oh boy, yeah. So again, it depends on the definition of completely shut down. If it's completely shut down, it's completely shut down, right? And the beauty of it these days is it's somewhat difficult to completely shut down communications, right? If certain governments try to do it, there's always a different way or a way around it. So part of it is we're very much proponents of belts and suspenders, right? And this is, again, another reason for asking employees to opt in and provide additional data for an opt-in portal, data that is not shared with HR or others, that is completely masked away from the managers and employers. The whole idea there is let the system try as many different ways as possible and then try and try and try again. However, as soon as a response is received from the recipient, that you stop trying, right? That you've ultimately gotten that acknowledgement that that message has been received. So, you know, try sending out a text, try a push notification, try an email, try another email, try yet another email, make a phone call, try it again, try a secondary phone call. Ultimately, if every single means of communication is down, you're not going to be able to get through, right? You'll have to have, instead of ultimately a one-to-one communication, try to find them in some other way or try to communicate with them in some other way. Social media, you know, big signs, whatever it is. All of that is possible via a multimodal communication mechanism. But the key is to automate that. You're not going to have a bunch of people trying that over and over and over again. And what's key is also to be able to know when to stop so that you're not necessarily either overwhelming the local communications infrastructure, which is what happened during the wildfires, et cetera, or and ultimately that you're not over-communicating so that people know when to pay attention to a message they've received, because it's not simply the same message you've been attempting to send them again and again and again, because once they've responded to it, you've stopped. So the next time they see a message, they'll know it's new. And sending out a pigeon with a message is not a supported modality.
All right. Thank you so much, Imad. That's all the time we have for questions today. Please join me in thanking Imad Moeen for his presentation, as well as our sponsor, Everbridge. If you have any additional questions or comments, Please don't hesitate to click the Email Us button on the console. Please visit securitymagazine.com/webinars for the archive of this presentation, as well as information about our upcoming events. We appreciate your time and hope that you have found this webinar to be a valuable experience.